Buenas tardes, good evening, bienvenidos. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes Manchester and Leeds YouTube channel. First of all, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our guests, Dr. Rebecca Ingram and Professor Rosi. Thank you to all of you for joining us in this first event of the 2023 of our series Ex Libris, Publications in Hispanic Studies. This series is being organized in collaboration with Professor Rosi, who is professor and deputy head of the School of Modern Languages and Culture at the Durham University. In this series, we discuss the recent works on topic of contemporary Hispanic culture in British and American academia. Our host and coordinator of the series, we are now in the third year, fortunately, is Professor Rosi, who has published many works on contemporary Spanish culture, film, and literature. Some of her publications include Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating as co-author. Also, Traces of Contamination, Unearthing the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse, and Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida as co-editor. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Hispanic Cultural Studies, MLN, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among others. And then our special guest, Dr. Rebecca Ingram, is professor at the University of San Diego. She teaches Spanish in courses in modern and contemporary Iberian cultural studies and literature, and she's an expert in food studies and feminist theory, and also she's affiliated at the Faculty in Women's and Gender Studies. Professor Ingram's research involves food and cultural studies in relation to Spain. She's author of articles appearing in the Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, Cincinnati Romance Review, and Bulletin of Spanish Studies. She has also published book chapters in these edited collections. Approaches to Teaching, the works of Emilia Pardo Bazán, Multiple Modernities, Carmen Burgos, author and activist, and Trout Sledge, Companion to the 20th and 21st Century Spain, Ideas, Practices, Imaginings, and Forthcoming. Today, our discussion will be focused on the launch of her book, of Rebecca Ingram's book, Women's Work, How Culinary Cultures Shaped Modern Spain. The book has been published by Vanderbilt University Press, and it has been widely acclaimed by critics and academics alike. I want to speak about the book, Rosi and Rebecca will, but I would like to quote Robert Davidson, who has said that it's a clean and concise, it is a tight book without any filter, that's what it sets out to do. This is a great cultural studies work and rich scholarship. Ingram is to be congratulated for expanding our understanding of gendered food work in Spain during the early 20th century. We also, from Cervantes Institute, Leeds, and Manchester, we congratulate Professor Ingram for this wonderful book. And without further ado, I give the floor to Rosi. Thank you very much. Only to remind you that our next Ex Libris will be on the 9th of May with the book Transatlantic Studies, Latin America, Iberia, and Africa, with authors are Cecilia Enjuto Range and Ali. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Rosi.
Thank you so much, Pedro Eusebio. Good afternoon, evening, or actually even good morning, those who are joining us from different parts of the world. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much, Instituto Cervantes, to hosting us again. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome Rebecca Ingram, collaborator, somebody that I've learned so much over the years about food, culture, and gender in modern Spain. And it gives me so much pleasure to be able to kick off this year's Ex Libris and with such a book celebrating Women's History Month, and actually ahead of the International Women's Day, which is tomorrow. So we're a bit ahead, right, for the celebrations. Welcome, Rebecca, and congratulations again for your book.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you also to the Manchester Instituto Cervantes. I feel very lucky to be here with you all today.
Thank you. So let's jump right in. So your book, please show it again. I actually had to lend mine because people wanted to read it. So I wasn't able to get it back in time. So Women's Work, How Culinary Culture Shaped Modern Spain is actually a very important study, as already we've mentioned. And one of the important aspects of this book is that it reveals how bodies and labor involved in the preparation of food are actually very gender and therefore controlled. And in the historical period where your book focuses on, it actually reveals this tension between traditional gender roles and the process of modernization. So you actually think and talk about this idea of women's work, right? So can you tell us more about this concept? What do you call, or what do you mean by women's work, and the importance of discussing this tension between gender and modernity?
Well, I don't know about y'all, but women's work was a term that I grew up hearing all the time in a very dismissive way. There was women's work, that was the stuff you didn't talk about, that was the stuff that belonged to the home. And of course it was uncompensated, right? If we think about early 20th century Spain, most of women's work, both outside the home and with inside the home, wasn't really taken into account in any kind of official record keeping. In the public sphere, women who worked for wages, that work was undercounted by the state. Within the home, women who worked as domestic servants, that labor was not counted at all. And then of course we have to consider the work that women did within their own households. But what we see in the early 20th century is that women began to enter the public labor force in numbers that were unprecedented right around the First World War. Women's work had obviously long existed, but for the middle class, it was something you weren't supposed to talk about. That was explicitly what Margarita Nelken talked about. If you wanted to appear middle class, you didn't acknowledge that you labored for wages. And so the texts that I study really look at how a group of writers and intellectuals from the early 20th century negotiated and responded to those tumultuous times. I think all of us here know the different political and social and economic changes that were happening in early 20th century Spain. And they talk about these changes, they react to these changes through their culinary writing. Culinary writing that was a legitimate discourse, and they showed that it had a discourse, it was a discourse that had consequences for the nation, for understanding citizenship and understanding Spain's modernization. But I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that culinary writing can only go so far if we're thinking about women's work. Culinary writing captures that work, which is very ephemeral. It captures it incompletely. And so if we think about a recipe tries to tell us step by step, the steps that we need to take to produce a certain thing. Recipes, instructions can also attempt to control the practices of those who are reading them, most often women. Writers, they tell us stories in recipes. They tell us stories in their paratexts. But the thing to keep in mind is these representations of women's work are not neutral. They are absolutely political, they're ideological. And this is something I show throughout the book, that these print cultures of cuisine really circulated new thinking about food in domestic spaces. And they challenge hegemonic thinking about women's roles. And we're talking about the conventional angel of the house paradigm, through an analysis of a genre that on the surface would seem to offer no challenge at all. So that's kind of my approach to this idea of women's work. But I think there's two additional things that we have to keep in mind. And these are ideas that come from Psyche Williams-Forson, who's written a lot about food work in the Black community in the United States. It's complicated. There are tensions, there are contradictions, there are juxtapositions, and you see that in that analysis. And Meredith Abarca, who has written about Latinx women and their food work, she tells us that it's still a very valuable site and source of knowledge. So that's kind of my understanding of food work and how I've tried to develop it in the 4 chapters of the book.
Thank you so much for that very thorough answer. And I think that you're absolutely right? So to talk about women's work in a very dismissive way, but actually turning this idea and actually working to value and visualize and make it visible, this work, I think is really important. So you actually start your book from, shall we say, a literary perspective, actually, right? So the 2 authors that you write about are two very well-known, very important women writers, right? First, the Countess Emilia Pardo Bazán from the late 19th century, and Carmen de Burgos, a mid-20th century writer. Can you tell us why their stories and why do you think their work related to cooking and food culture should be remembered?
Right. Well, I don't know about y'all, but whenever I first started researching this topic, I was fascinated that 2 of the writers that we most associate with modern feminism in Spain, they just happened to write cookbooks. And I was like, how do we make sense of this, right? Emilia Pardo Bazán, she wrote her cookbooks out of desperation, out of frustration. They were the 2 books that concluded her Biblioteca de la Mujer, this series that she imagined that was supposed to teach Spanish women about feminism and present them with these ideas that were circulating abroad so that feminism would really take root. They didn't sell very well. She was very frustrated that they didn't sell better than they did. And so she thought, well, I'll try with cookbooks and we'll see what happens, right? Carmen de Burgos, on the other hand, she wrote these books or participated in their production, and people have generally thought of them as texts that she wrote to earn money. She was estranged from her husband. She was a single mother, and she was supporting herself through her writing. But when you read closely the paratextual materials that are part of these cookbooks, both authors reveal really fascinating perspectives about Spain's food cultures, but also modernization and women's roles in them. And so that's kind of how I got into studying both these figures, although I will say I am not a Pardo Bazanista. There are other folks, many of whom who are here, several of whom who are, who have a much better grasp of all of her literary writing and the intersections of food. I adore Carmen de Burgos, but other folks have definitely read much more closely her literary works, or the works that we consider literary in her collection. I don't know, do you want me to talk further about what I argue in the books, Rosi? Did you have questions?
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit? So as you said, right, so there are 2 actually very different writers and writing from very different perhaps context of necessity, right?
Right.
Emilia Pardo Bazán saying, you know, this is that I'm trying to do in terms of literary sort of work. Nobody's paying attention, so I'll just do this that, you know, people expect me to do, which is women's work, you know. Right. And then on the other side, you have Carmen Burgos that actually is monetizing on women's work, right? But in the process, as you say, you know, they produce paratext that allows us to understand more what is going on, sort of that dynamics of that moment. So perhaps not only tell us a little bit about that material that you work with, but what was interesting to discover, or perhaps something that you weren't expecting to find, and that you actually were discovering through their work.
So with Emilia Pardo Bazán, I don't think anybody would be surprised, especially with the work that's come out about her in the past few years. She was absolutely a culinary nationalist. She did the work to show that we can think about food and cooking as another of those nation-building discourses that were being produced in the 19th century to write the nation into existence. She constructs very explicit parallels between cooking and folklore, between cooking and literature, between cooking and ethnography. And so it's interesting because she absolutely gives women a key role in the production and preservation of cooking as a national discourse, which I read as a feminist gesture. But she has a very different perspective when it comes to the modern women that she was also trying to teach about modern Spanish cuisine. I think that her vision of Spain's modern cuisine has to do with aesthetics. She writes that la cocina más corriente y barata admite escenografía. So, you know, it has to look good. It can't be all of these old traditional recipes that aren't aesthetically pleasing when looking at them on the table. And so ultimately what I show, and what is surprising, or at least it was to me whenever I was working on this chapter, is that according to Pardo Bazán, modern cooking is a domain that belongs to middle-class women, or women who aspire to the middle class. It's important to the health of the Spanish nation, to the health of the Spanish race, and I'm quoting her in saying that. But what we see is that she writes working class women, these cocineras who were doing so much of the day-to-day cooking in middle-class households, she writes them completely out of a modern culinary project for Spain. And I would argue, you know, out of Spanish modernity itself. She, you know, is quite explicit in that kind of class bias that she shows in this writing. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of, you know, arrival to that. I think as I've worked on these texts over time and read so much about them, I always talk to my students how you tend to put certain writers on a pedestal, right? And you want to hope and think about the best for them. And with Pardo Bazán, I always end up a little desilusionada where I started when I first started researching her work. And it's curious because Carmen de Burgos presents a very different case. Like, she was absolutely into cookbook writing. They're listed as her arreglos, right? To monetize that project. On the surface, these books are not doing anything. Like, you read them and you're like, oh, this is just the texto de complacencia that she has to write to quedar bien with her publisher. But I really was taken with an idea that Maite Zubiaurre first articulated, called double writing. And it's this idea where you're writing one message. It's that, you know, performed femininity, it's that construction to femininity that's there to satisfy the folks who were in charge of that publication machine that she was part of by necessity. But underneath that kind of frivolous chatter, she really embeds some fascinating ideas about possibilities for women. And they reach women in their everyday lives, in cookbooks, in places where you would least expect them to do so. And these are not books that she just wrote to earn money, although she still earned money with them. And I think the most interesting kind of evidence for that is when her 1925 cookbook came out, La Nueva Cocina Práctica. This was, you know, a re-edition of the previous one. She essentially wrote a brand new introduction to that cookbook that expanded what was a 7-page introduction into a 64-page essay that really replicates in style a lot of her more scholarly work that scholars have studied over the past few decades. So, you know, not entirely serious writing, but definitely serious ideas that she embedded into those texts that circulated as products in this very vibrant literary marketplace of the early 20th century.
Yeah, thank you. And really, with that understanding, actually going back to the text should be eye-opening for many of our listeners. So let's move on into that book. So from these more established writers and known characters in Spanish literature, you actually turn your attention to a very surprising intersection between women's food work and health, right? And you actually connect the well-known medical doctor, Gregorio Marañón, to the owner of a popular restaurant, Nicolasa Pradera, right? From San Sebastián, the Basque Country. So can you tell us a little bit more about this connection and about this, probably what, Emilia Pardo Bazán would have just called a cocinera, right? Yeah, so this woman, her story, how did you recover it and how do you connect to the medical discourse of 20th century? Yeah.
No, it's interesting because I think Pradera is a very well-known, relatively well-known example of something that's pretty infrequently discussed, to my knowledge, especially in studies of this period, and that is the social and economic mobility of working class and peasant women. We see that Pradera, and I'm quoting my friend Martin, this was his summary of her career, she cooks herself up the social ladder, in ways that are surprising. And I just want to acknowledge Montserrat Miller's work in Feeding Barcelona, because she really sets a lovely kind of marco, a framework for understanding women that belonged into this social class. They're not exactly this old paradigm of angel at the house. They're not middle-class women, but they're women who have always worked in the public sphere, whose class status changes from working class to an entrepreneurial middle class in the early 20th century. So Pradera, all of this kind of class mobility came about directly through her cooking, through her food work. She started her working life as an ayudante de cocina, like 12, 13 years old, working in the kitchen of an aristocratic family in the Basque Country. When she passed away, her biography was published in the Times of London and all the major newspapers of Spain, just to give you an idea of this. She was the owner with her spouse of Casa Nicolasa, a restaurant that only closed in 2010. She sold this restaurant and moved to Madrid in the 1930s and opened 2 other restaurants. But I think this is social mobility that, we should think about more. I think it's more interesting to think about, other cases of women who are in situations similar to Pradera. And Marañón was a total fanboy. He was like such a fan of her cooking, and convinced her, according to Ana Vega, that she should put her recipes into the cookbook that I analyzed. So Marañón is somebody that we know as a physician researcher, as an architect of Spain's Second Republic. And what we're used to seeing from him is that he would apply his scientific mindset to understanding food and nutrition. This is something that we see in a book that, of his gastronomical or food writing that is most well known, Gordos y Flacos, which came out in 1926. He also wrote a number of essays. It's probably the case that his Elogio Médico de la Naranja is most well known, and Laura Anderson has written extensively about that work. But with Pradera and her food work, Marañón says that he suspends his scientific mindset. He writes about Pradera as the sacerdotisa of Basque cuisine. And what I show is that he really constructs an authorial persona of Pradera that fulfills a specific political and ideological agenda. So none of this stuff about Pradera and how she started as an ayudante de cocina and opened restaurants, that's not there, right? What is there are her connections to a Basque peasantry, to Marañón's own nursemaid, the things that he ate whenever he was a child, right? So he uses her gender and social class to essentialize her as representative of a Basque people and a culinary tradition that he argues is modern, right? Because he's like tying this to modern cuisine, to France, and Pradera, he doesn't explicitly say it, but she absolutely had culinary training. But it's also authentic at the same time. He's very specific with that language. Most important, it's palatable. It's tasty. It's not castiza, cocina castiza with like all the garlic and the onions and this reputation of bad cooking oil. And it's not haunted by the legacies of the Leyenda Negra, of the Black legend. So, you know, I think in the way he constructs her to present this authentic and modern version of Spain that's not tainted by either the Leyenda Negra or all of the political unrest that characterizes Spain in the 1930s. And so I think this framing of Pradera is a really interesting example of the kind of food work that working class and marginally middle class women undertook as professionals throughout the 20th century. Ana Vega, who's a journalist publishing in lots of media here in Spain, has been discussing and bringing to light stories of these cocineras over recent months. And they're fascinating. I told her that there's a book there, but unfortunately, Ana has said that people in Spain don't want to read about las señoras cocineras. And I hope that that's not the case, because there's lots of fascinating stories to tell there.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the fact that actually from women's work, we're talking about women who work, right? Yes. And the importance of this work actually, because they at the end connect to larger ideas. I think it is quite interesting that for Marañón, Nicolasa's cooking actually connected to his own memory, right? And what he understood about his own roots, right? Exactly. And the idea of that modern cooking, perhaps embodied in someone like Nicolasa, actually is a different idea of modernity that Emilia Pardo Bazán had, right? Absolutely. So it's not so much about this posture, but actually a person that's in the kitchen cooking, having learned this process. And it's a different kind of relationship with that tradition, I think.
It is a different kind of relationship, but I think there's still some interesting class dynamics that also surface. Because as much as he's highlighting that aspect of Nicolasa's, of Pradera's participation or creation of a modern Spanish cuisine, he still connects her to this, you know, centenary tradition, to this idea of a Basque pueblo that's very much idealized. And so I think it's absolutely different than what we see in Pardo Bazán, but I see a similar vein in how both of those writers do idealize this idea of a peasantry, a Basque peasantry or a Spanish peasantry, as this kind of receptacle of culinary traditions that kind of stays constant over time. I think the thing that Marañón does that's fascinating is he labels that as modern. He labels that as something that can represent Spain, not just to other Spaniards, but also to outsiders. And I think that, you know, part of what I go into in the chapter is how a lot of the ideas that he's talking about that he develops in this prologue are consistent with how the Spanish state was working to develop a tourism industry in the period in Spain.
Now, already there, at least, you know, thinking about how to sell, not to sell, but how to talk about the periphery, right? And actually thinking a little bit of what you said about this contrast between, you know, this cuisine that is not castizo, right? That is actually better. And it's surprising that a lot of these sort of talk about sort of the goodness or the merits of Spanish cooking actually come from the peripheries. I mean, let's not forget that, you know, Pardo Bazán also comes from the area of Galicia. We think about the Basque Country, we think about Catalonia, and so on. Yeah.
And this goes to an idea that Laura Anderson has articulated, like the construction of Spanish cuisine comes in the unity of its diversity, right?
Right.
Bringing it together in this kind of book that says it's national, but what we see are these different regional cuisines that come together.
Right. Yeah, and actually, I like when Lara actually makes that contrast with the French case, in which everything has to pass through Paris. So that's the Frenchification of the French cuisine, while in Spain, actually, it's different. And I think that not many people are aware of sort of that contrast, right? The way that actually the regional cooking actually overtakes sort of this idea of a national cuisine. But moving forward to that idea of women who work, So actually, you moved to a very interesting case of a case where actually women are taught how to work, or actually are given the tools to do this work. And we're actually interestingly talking about a character who is a foreigner who arrives to Barcelona. We don't know exactly from where. We think that it comes from Italy via Switzerland. And actually he is, if we can say, one of the early star chefs, right? Everybody knows. We're talking about Giuseppe Rondisoni, who was actually a teacher at the Instituto de la Dona in Barcelona. Can you tell us a little bit about this character and how you relate his work to actually women's work?
Right. So, I mean, he's totally a celebrity chef, Rondisoni is. This idea of celebrity chef was not born in the late 20th or early 21st century. Our first example is not Arguiñano and his cooking show the day on Spanish TV, right? There were celebrity chefs in the early 20th century. Rondisoni and Ignacio Domenech are like the two major figures that we would consider celebrity chefs today. And yet he launched that celebrity persona, that celebrity career, from the Instituto de Cultura y Biblioteca Popular de la Dona. So this was a really interesting civic and educational institution that was born in Barcelona in 1909. It was founded by a Catalan nationalist and politically involved figure, a woman named Francesca Bonmason. She founded first a lending library, and it was a suggestion from her priest, who was known as one of the more progressive, I guess, priests of the moment. And when it was first opened, it was considered the first lending library for women in all of Europe. But then it quickly expanded its focus, its scope, the courses it offered, and installations. It moved very quickly from where it was founded, I think, a decade afterwards, to just extensive installations in El Carrer de Sant Baix in Barcelona. And its purpose was to donar cultura, or to give culture to women. And it identified working women, working class women, obreras, as its target student body from the very earliest days. And so coincidentally, it also taught cooking classes. Cooking classes were some of the most popular since its very early days. Giuseppe Rondisoni started working at the Institute in 1918. Just to give you an idea of how many people it attracted, over 40,000 students in 1922, which was a tremendous number of folks to take cooking classes at the Institute. I think it's fascinating that the Institute is, it was founded by somebody that we don't tend to associate with feminist or progressive thought. A devoutly Catholic, conservative, bourgeois Catalan woman. And yet its curricula were informed by one of the most progressive pedagogues of the early 20th century, Rosa. It recognized and supported a version of economic feminism, that women needed to work, and they did so, and they needed training and support for that work through education. It offered a jobs board, it offered opportunities for hygiene, showers, for example, at its installations, in addition to an inexpensive cafeteria. So, I think we tend to think about the Institute as a place where only the top-notch Barcelona señoritas went to see and be seen, and that was certainly the case. But there were also many, many working class women who sought education there in cooking classes, where they learned how to cook according to Rondisoni's style, but they also learned to read in those cooking classes. And they went on to professional work as servers in restaurants and hotels, as professionally trained cooks in restaurants, and also in the homes of, people with money. One of those women, and I start the chapter talking a little bit about her, was Maria Badia. She had come to Barcelona, initially as a servant, took classes with Rondisoni, And it really changed her life in ways that we see that are similar to that of Nicolasa Pradera. And so these were women through whose practices, through whose culinary, their practices sustained a style that we associate with Rondisoni. And when I started working on this, I always found it fascinating that Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, this figure that we associate with, all contemporary talk of foodscapes in Spain and the cuisine and gastronomy, he credited these women and their culinary practices with the survival and the recuperation of a specifically Barcelona-based gastronomy after the end of Francoism. And so it was really a lovely opportunity to delve into the Institute's archives and come up with some interesting findings.
Yes, and we will be reading that essay actually in the upcoming special monograph for the Cuadernos de la Asociación Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, where we're actually dedicating to gastronomy and the writing of gastronomy of Vázquez Montalbán. Oh, you mentioned Rondisoni's style of cooking. Do you want to say a little bit more about that style?
It was considered cosmopolitan. It was considered transnational. He combined versions of French recipes and Italian recipes and English recipes with food practices and dishes that Catalan women would recognize. Folks talked about this transition as one that evolved from what was a monotonous kind of daily cooking that characterized, the standard foodways of Barcelona before Rondisoni. So, we see industrialized food products like Maggi drops, I'm never sure how to pronounce that. Specific brands of cocoa powder, specific brands of baking soda. And so that's an interesting facet, and also part of his celebrity creation, these collaborations with food brands and industrial food marketing. And he also had an interesting collaboration through the Institute with the gas company in Barcelona, who installed gas cooking stoves in the Institute so women could learn to cook on them and create demand for those kinds of cooking stoves in households throughout Barcelona. But interesting, like some people say Rondisoni was, sensitive to the spending that a dish required, the budget required to prepare a certain dish. I think that's what he tends to be known for. What was surprising is that I did not find that material in the archives that I looked at, although it's something I've seen repeated from a number of folks who have written about him.
Yeah, and you actually talk about the two types of teaching that he does, because he does teach, let's say, sort of the case that you mentioned of this young woman that comes from the rural area to serve in a home, and then she goes and takes these classes and sort of goes through that sort of social mobility through her cooking. But Rondisoni also knew how to cater to actually middle-class women. And you do mention these other classes that he taught, right?
Yeah, so there were different classes. There was cocina práctica classes and cocina casera classes. And the archives don't distinguish super well, like when one transitioned to the other. And I think it's interesting as you look at his recipe books and you see a lot of them are the same recipes. What was interesting to think about is how within that institute and looking at this kind of class division in cooking classes is how we see kind of a class-oriented stratification within the institute as the years go by, like up to the 1930s. And to be clear, like these working class women who were taking classes here, they're not learning how to cook for their own households. Like, just want to be clear, like this is not the point of their learning. These are not necessarily food practices that they're going to carry back into their own homes. This is for their cooking in other people's households or in professional contexts. And I think that's something that, we have to keep in mind because that's part of the reality of working class life during the early 20th century.
So it is about training, right? And learning a skill. And obviously, if we talk about food, we need to also offer visuals. And I do understand that you have prepared some images for us. So I would like to invite you to share some of those as we slowly wrap up our conversation, because I have this feeling that we'll have a lot of questions today. So if you start typing your questions on the comment section, or at some point when I call you, please raise your hands and we'll call on you so you can ask the questions to Rebecca. All right, so what are we watching here? What are we seeing?
So first, I think it's a fascinating image of La Condesa de Barbatan. This was an image of her that circulated in media in Spain. The years aren't entirely correct according to the archivist that I spoke with, but she's selling olive oil. And so this is really fascinating kind of visual representation of how important she thought cooking was to the health of the Spanish nation. But it also makes me think, yeah, she was really worried about her series not selling well, and she wanted the last 2 cookbooks to sell well. I posted this to Twitter back in the fall, and it was interesting to see, because there's a recipe that becomes at the bottom, all the discussion that ensued about the irrationality of the recipe that she posted, like the quantities of meat that it called for, the different kinds of meat in the same dish. And I think folks were really surprised. So I love this image. I think it's always fun to use in class. The second set of images I have is to show the cover of the book, but also its inspiration, which was Carmen de Burgos's cookbook, Nueva Cocina Práctica. This was an illustration by Bon, who was a well-known illustrator of the 1920s. He created covers for Burgos's books, also Ramon Gómez de la Serna's books. And I just think it's a fascinating image. The way it really, we see the electrical, what I assume is an electrical light above the title. And then we have in its focus these 2 women at the table. And so I thought it really captured this kind of idea of not just food that the book is about, but about women's food work. And so happily, copyright laws allowed me to use this to adapt the cover to my book. And then we have an image of Pradera that was given to me by her grandson. And Ana Vega had done some editing of this image in a publication about Pradera that she had in the press here in Spain. And I was grateful to be able to give readers the ability to imagine this very interesting and complex woman that Marañón discursively creates in his prologue about her work. And then finally, the contemporary picture of the Instituto de Cultura Biblioteca Popular de Barcelona, which is now the Biblioteca Francesca Bonmaison in Barcelona. But we have images of cooking classes. And so when these images first circulated as part of an exhibition about the chefs of the Second Republic, the librarian at the Francesca Bonmaison told me that there were señoras who came in who were like, oh, no, that's not Rondisoni. That's not Rondisoni. But every kind of person who has written about him says that he is. And so I felt this uncertainty about women who supposedly took classes with him saying, no, this is not him, or maybe heard stories of their own female relatives who did. I thought that was an interesting kind of anecdote about these images. And then, of course, it's interesting to do the analysis of the women that we see in this kind of stadium type cooking classroom. And then we have another kind of cooking class where we see Rondisoni, or we assume to be Rondisoni, supervising women cooking in what was called the laboratorio, the laboratory for cooking. So I was delighted to be able to include these images in the book.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you brought these images, and I'm particularly grateful for Nicolasa Pradera's picture, photograph, because I always try to imagine how she looked like, and and I wasn't, and this is really great. So thank you so much. So thinking about this work that you've done, where do you think this way of thinking about women's work, women who work, in this area of labor that wasn't quite recognized. Perhaps when men talk about cooking, it's a lot more glorious, it's a lot more sort of has this cultural value. But how do you build value in women's food work, right? And where do you think your research is going to take you next?
I think there's still a lot to do. I think anybody who follows how haute cuisine or alta cocina is discussed in media today, and by the generations of fantastic gastronomic journalists who are writing about food in Spain today, that scene, that foodscape has a gender problem. If you think about, if we are using Michelin stars to determine how a particular culture or state or society values its food producers. So I think there's still one area of investigation that goes off those lines. Another line of investigation has to do with care work and food work and how it looks in 21st century Spain. Who are the folks who are doing this work? How is it acknowledged and valued by the state? Also by how folks talk about their care workers and their food workers in restaurants, in their homes, in those contexts. I have not written about this, but it was a fascinating opportunity to think in an event that Joanne Bretland organized during the pandemic that brought together a number of graphic artists who were working in Spain and Latin America. Juan So was there. And so she talked about this issue of who are the food workers in contemporary Spain. They are racialized Spaniards. And she talked about that dynamic as one of exploitation. And I think that there is an interesting and necessary kind of vein of investigation that should take into account their experiences, their work, and also to what degree their labor and their cultural production is something that we see as part of contemporary foodscapes in Spain, and to what degree that kind of labor and work is rendered invisible. And so lots of big questions, but yeah, I've got some exciting new areas to explore. And for folks who are interested in food studies, this is my invitation to come and join us.
Absolutely,
it's a really
absolutely.
exciting area of research, as Rosi can attest to. Yeah.
It's very, there's so many questions, so why don't we welcome some from our audience. If you have any questions, please turn on your mic, your microphone. I don't see any questions per se in the chat box, but please join us in the conversation if you have any questions for Rebecca. Oh, Juan said that she put a question in the Q&A, but I have not seen it.
I can also just ask it if that's easier.
Yes, yes. Could you please? Hi.
Sorry for my sick voice. Rebecca, thank you so much for, well, both the book and this fabulous talk. And I have a quick question based on the remarks you made about Carmen de Burgos and Amina Parabassan's cookbooks. So you have this, you gave this fascinating overview of kind of the paratexts for these two books. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the recipes themselves, right? Do you see any substantive differences in terms of like, what kind of ingredients they're recommending, if it's clear that they're speaking to different audiences, or do they have a different tone in terms of what kind of instructions they're giving? So I would be a little bit curious about the actual wording in the recipes. Thank you,
Juan, for that question. First of all, I have to say, and this is something that I am citing from Carmen Simón Palmer, who is one of the first historians to ever talk about culinary texts in Spain, is that Carmen de Burgos likely had nothing to do with the recipes at all. I don't know if we can substantiate that. I have not seen the evidence to say if that is, the truth or not. I certainly support Carmen's reading of that. But what we have tended to look for in recipes, especially cookbooks that are written by figures like Carmen de Burgos, perhaps, or more accurately, Emilia Pardo Bazán, is a kind of authorial voice that tells us something about that person and their approach to different recipes. That was not the super big focus of this work, although what I was fascinated to find when I went back and reread Emilia Pardo Bazan's recipes was her assessment of the kinds of recipes that were meant for folks who were not super high on that class list. Like this is this could be a humble recipe. This is something that anybody could eat, but this is something that was much more elegant and much more un plato más elevado. And so I think those kind of assessments of the different recipes and the different foods are an interesting kind of addition to understanding her class perspective when it comes to cooking and eating. In terms of a detailed analysis of the recipes, I know that, oh goodness, I'm totally blanking. Our colleague at Emory, who has written on Pardo Bazan's recipes, had an interesting analysis of them, and also Maria Paz Moreno. I would take a look at her book. Those are excellent resources, excellent scholarship to look at to understand more about those recipes. Thank you for the question, Ann.
Yeah, and I think that actually when you look at those recipes, you're very surprised about the quantities and sort of like there are no measurements. So you just have to follow you have to know how to cook in order to follow these recipes. That is one thing.
I think that there are two comments to add on to what you just said, Rosi, and with that, I'll be quiet. Janet Acosta, who's with the Foodie Studies, who's here. We've talked about this recently, these imprints or presses that are located and supported by regional governance, like the Junta de Andalucía, for example, with the press Colicol. That's one that Janet recently told me about. And then another thing is to think about the models of something like El Bulli that never made money with the restaurant. How did they make money? Cookbooks and collaborations. All of this marketing, all of this big buildup with supermarkets, with, leisure industries, tourism industries, things like that. And so that goes to what you were just signaling, Rosi, about celebrity.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We've gone over the time. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here with us today. Thank you so much for all of us who joined us from all over the place. I mean, from Spain, the UK, the US. Thank you so much. And join us again in a few weeks, or perhaps a month and a half. May 9th is our next Ex Libris. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rosi. Thank you, Rebecca. It was a really great talk. Thank you.
Gracias. Thanks, everybody.
Muchas gracias.